It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Suki Cheema. I had the pleasure of meeting Suki, early last year?
Yeah, it's around all this time.
Early last year, about this time last year. He has an extraordinary history and career in textile design and is a great talent to have here in South Australia, having a great global practice. And it seemed entirely appropriate with the opening of our big textile design exhibition last week to have Suki be one of the presenters of the Wednesday Talks while the show was on. So thanks so much for agreeing, and over to you.
Brilliant. Hi. Hello, everyone. So my name is Suki Cheema, and I'm a textile designer, worked in New York, London, and now based in South Australia. Moved over here early last year and developing my practice here. I'm going to really go through my work and my experience over the years. I studied at Central St. Martin's in London, graduated in '99, and moved to New York in early 2000 and worked there for designers and in the industry for about 11 years before moving back to the UK. So I'm really going to start off with my practice and kind of like my earlier work when I worked in fashion. Textile was always my background was really fine art, and textile was for me was always in kind of having a canvas to really experiment with and express myself. But yet that canvas can be used, whether it's interiors, it's fashion, it could be fine art, you can do whatever you want with it. So that's why I always loved textiles as in that sense. So that's kind of when I was earlier days trying to figure out what I really wanted to do. I did photography, graphics, textiles, and then I really leaned towards textiles, from a fine art background into textiles, and then ended up getting my Central St. Martin's starting at Central St. Martin's back in '96, and worked my way, and it was great because we got to experiment, and it was really very experimenting with objects, materials. You did weave, knit, and print. And then I ended up specializing in textile print because it kind of gave me the same medium as kind of painting again, but literally painting on fabric. So I ended up graduating from St. Martin's and did that backpack around the world, traveled, gathered inspiration, and then got back and ended up with a job offer in New York. And in 2002, I started working as textile print designer for Diane von Furstenberg, a fashion brand in the US, who I ended up, it was a very small brand back then. There was only about 4 of us working at a small little studio in the West Village, and we would do all our own fabrics and prints in-house. So every textile inspiration that Diane bought, we would then create textiles by hand, and then scan that design into the computer, and then translate it into a Photoshop repeat design, and then send it out to factories to basically get the fabrics done. But we also set up our own Pacific print and dye lab in-house. So we were actually printing and dyeing our own fabrics and experimenting with textiles and repeat. And the big thing about textiles when you're doing designs is if you do very computer-aided design, it becomes very flat. So we would always do our designs literally by hand first to do the layout. So you actually had a movement within the design. So when you look at a textile design, you don't really want your eye to focus on one area. It's got to move around the design. So it's very key when Diane wanted it all work by hand first. So you experiment, you play, you do the whole layout, and then we would get that layout scanned in, cleaned in Photoshop, and then sent out to the factories to get printed onto fabric. And it's always screen printed out of China to start with. I'm going to go to one of my earlier works at DVF. So this is my earlier work at DVF. So all of these designs you see here were literally all done in-house. Like this one up here, the dip dyed one, we literally hand dyed all of that fabric in-house. And for me, it was brilliant, being a textile artist and working really hands-on experimenting and dyeing fabrics. Even this one there was all hand dyed, about 40 meters in-house. Again, the design up there was all hand painted. The layout done before we sent it out to get printed by fabrics, printed by a mill. These designs were all, basically, this was all hand painted on silk organza. And the organza was stretched out on frames, and we did about 40 meters in-house in our own studio. Again, these designs, I'll move on to an image of screen printing. So you see this design here, this was all pattern cut, and then we sort of painted exactly onto the fabric. So this is sort of where, in the print room, so you saw that design there. So this was actually literally painting it all by hand, creating the design. This was all silk screened in-house. So all of this sort of very sort of hands-on. And that was a great idea of sort of working at DVF. It was very hands-on, very driven. And, you know, Diane would come up with the color. She'll just bring different fabrics in. And it was literally sort of working in this amazing creative studio. After working with DVF for probably 11 years, I then sort of veered off and sort of always kind of played with the idea of fashion and home. So I kind of dilly-dallied between the two quite often. And DVF did a stint in home in 2008, which we launched. And briefly, it was sort of high-end furnishings and sort of rugs with the rug company. So we took a lot of DVF designs and prints and transferred them onto rugs. And that's basically a licensing agreement with the rug company. And then in sort of 2011, I decided to sort of veer off and sort of start Suki Cheema Home, which is my own homewares brand. And with Diane's blessing, and sort of ended up sort of exhibiting at Accent on Design in New York after designing the collection, and got picked up by Barney's, Bloomingdale's, Neiman Marcus, which was great, and it was a good platform to sort of launch the brand. And sort of moving on, sort of when I start my textiles, it's literally, I'll sort of sketch and draw by hand, and inspiration can come from travel, books. Like every time I've gone around the world, I'm always taking photos and everything else, and I always keep them sort of backed up on hard drives. Suddenly I've got these hard drives with all these files on them that I dig back into, and it's the inspiration that I sort of get from that, and I sketch from everyday life that I then translate into textiles. So this is sort of like kind of moving on to sort of like me sketching ideas and then developing fabrics, like sort of painting this design and then working with the suppliers. You'll see the sort of cushion there. This was then sort of taken back. So I went sort of fly out to India. Then I work with the factories. And even though I've done the design on basically a Photoshop, sometimes we don't screen print it. We end up embroidering it. So we work with thread and techniques to sort of kind of give the designer sort of almost like a 3D sort of life feel. Again, so this is just, again, sort of sketching by hand, doodles, and then sort of translating them into design. So this was done like this, embroidered onto fabric. These designs here were scanned in and then played over again with another sort of technique. Again, all done embroidered. This is, again, sort of really sort of hand painting and drawing. This design ended up becoming a rug. This was actually a rug and woven into cushion designs. This is sort of like a little block design that's sort of sketched and etched with sort of charcoal colors. And then we created this design. We sort of screen printed it on fabric, but I still wanted to capture the texture in there. So we captured the texture, and then we actually printed and embroidered in sections of it in here as well. So this ended up being the cushion design. Again, sort of really sort of back to sort of hand drawing, experimenting, and then developing this. This is sort of silk screened with black embroidery in areas. More sort of hand drawing. And then it's sort of like inspiration boards. It's like taking inspiration from the Maasai tribes in Africa and everything else, and then sort of translating designs into cushions from my inspiration that I found that, you know, these tribes are painting their houses with these designs, which are absolutely fascinating. Again, taking inspiration from that and then translating it into textiles for home. More sort of inspiration mood boards. And it's really sort of key when you're sort of starting out, sort of doing textile or building a range or your own collection. It's really sort of getting your imagery and your mood boards together and your color palette, because that really is the focus. That's what makes a collection really tight. So once you've got your inspiration mood board, you can start developing, and then you've got your color palettes that you work with to start putting the collection together. This is sort of doing sort of working in India, in Jaipur. I did a bedding collection for Bloomingdale's, but we did everything sort of block printed. So I spent about 3 weeks working with block printers, like working in the factory and actually doing block printing designs and sort of actually printing sort of small swatches of fabric before we actually did sort of sample yardage. So that was kind of like the facility that I was working in and the blocks. And then sort of experimenting with color to make sure like the color for me is always key. So it's always making sure that each color we got it right. So as in every single shade. And this was again sort of going back to sort of block printing these designs that were then turned into cushions. And this is sort of going back, once these designs were done, it's going back into the factory and the showrooms, and we're working with them. And these are the samples that I created by hand, and then we're actually laying them on the bed, figuring out how this design's going to work. And it's all like sort of key, like selecting the fabrics at that stage, what's going to be washable and durable. Again, more designs for cushions. This is sort of like how we did all the color printing. So all the colors laid in here, this fabric's in there, so the actual color doesn't go too blotchy. So you kind of literally soak the block in there, and then you literally take it and just straight onto the fabric. And while I'm on that collection, I'm going to go to the PDF for the bedding collection for that. So that block printing that I did in the factory, we ended up coming back and then developing this entire bedding range that was exclusively for Bloomingdale's in New York. We did it all on sort of Belgium linen, and this is all hand block printed, and then obviously the fabric's treated and quilted and embroidered. Even working with the factory, like all of this is sort of like working with the detail of the thread and the stitching and the finishing, and that's where, you know, that's kind of, I enjoy all of this aspect of it. So literally you're there sitting on the floor with the factory with all these swatches that you've actually experimented and block printed, and then you're sort of translating them into textiles that are going to be actually end up becoming bedding. And a lot of these swatches, I bought sort of fabrics, and some of them are laying there so you can kind of see them afterwards, sort of how they sort of started and what they ended up becoming. And even after this design's done, we've ended up quilting this fabric to give it a whole different feel. And even like the flanges have got like an embroidered line there that gives it a whole nother depth of color. And this entire design is all machine embroidered. And this is sort of going back to, again, me sort of building ranges. So once my artwork's done, I've sort of sketched it on, and I've then taken it into Photoshop and translated sort of repeats and in colorways. So these designs that you'll see at the top, then take printouts, then I work with my suppliers and the factories in Asia, and then we start looking at these designs and we start working on techniques of how we're going to develop this design. So this was all embroidered. I love my blocks print, so we ended up quilting this, and just to try different techniques to give it a sort of a different feel. So this is kind of like the mood boards and sort of building the entire range. And again, you sort of see the design layouts, everything's done there, and then sort of literally color coding everything, sort of working with them. And the great thing is when I'm there, I'm working with the seamstress, I'm working with the embroidery machine guys. I'm sort of really sitting there next to the machine, I'm like looking at different techniques that can be achieved. And it's amazing, like a lot of some of these machines are computerized now, and the way they do the embroidery, they set the design in, and suddenly I'm seeing meters and meters of fabric and this machine moving around and creating the design. It's quite it's amazing when you're there on the ground seeing that happen. But it all sort of starts off like this. And I always end up getting like each print that we do, we end up printing it on paper life size. So we can actually lay it out on the bed. Before we actually print it, we'll have a life size of a paper print of it, we can really sort of see the scale. And it's key when you're designing textiles to make sure that you get the scale right and your dimensions and the repeat that when you're repeating onto the fabrics. Again, these designs were created, and then we started playing with different sort of embroidery techniques to create that sort of design pattern before we actually select what we're going to develop out of it. This was again sort of moving on to my earlier days, even at DVF, like dip dyeing is one of my, I absolutely enjoy it and love it. At DVF, we did a lot of dip dyeing and we sort of played with a lot of color. And then I was lucky enough to work on another project with Diane in Doha. They were developing these private residentials, and I think they had a couple of designers doing each room. And so Diane came back to me. She goes, "Oh, we want to do something cool for this project, dip dyed." So I worked with in India and worked. We had these handmade tassels, and they were all sort of dip dyed and sort of color gradations, kind of for this specific project. And you'll sort of see that they ended up coming absolutely beautiful. And then with my collection, I've done home and I sort of work with fashion as well. So this was like a collection that I developed for holiday resort, sort of like kind of a summer beach sort of collection. And again, with really sort of bold Suki Cheema sort of kind of geometric prints. This was again embroidered around the neckline. And then you'll see as we go. So this was all hand silk screened in Jaipur with one of my printing factories. And then I designed it. So you might have seen earlier when you saw on my sketch drawing boards that this design was there. We developed a rug out of this design. We ended up developing a sort of a beach kaftan out of this design. So all these designs are lean. You can transfer it from home to fashion. And all of these designs, again, some of them were cushions that ended up becoming these sort of summer kaftans. Dyed again. And it's sometimes like even I've done a design by hand, then I sort of work again, doing a lot of embroidery. Some of my designs majority of them end up being sometimes all embroidered. So you'll see some of the cushions down there, even though I've done the design by hand, but then actually when the finished product comes, it's actually all embroidered. Again, dyeing. And dyeing's a great aspect. It's always sort of blending the two colors together. So it's always, we'll make sure we have like a darker bath of one color and then a lighter bath of the same color. So then you can kind of go between the two baths to kind of sort of blend the color so you get this great gradation without getting a line. Again, working with embroidery around the neckline. Again, we did this sort of scarf collection. Again, this was all hand dip dyed and then screen printed. And then sort of going on to my homewares collection. So once I've developed all the mood boards and I work with the factories, we then start developing the ranges from my little swatches. Like in my studio, I've just like drawers and boxes full of like tiny little fabric swatches. I just sort of keep them. But this is sort of like showing you sort of the finished product. This is actually, I wanted to do a dip dyed sort of color thing, but without having to dip dye the fabric. So this is all computer embroidered to give this sort of gradation effect that it looks like it's dyed. So I've got a sample, there'll be just the yellow one there, so it will show you the technique. Again, this is screen printed and then embroidered in sections. So after sort of working with it, then this is sort of me then range building. And then once the range build is done, it's shooting the collection. One thing that's basically when I worked in fashion, it was always sort of basically working and designing. But when you start working for yourself, you're kind of wearing all the hats. You've got to basically design, production, cost. You've got to work with your suppliers. You've got to try and get your cost right. And then you've got to sort of figure out your wholesale and retail pricing and everything else. And that's sort of an element that I really sort of enjoyed as well as almost like kind of learning this whole business side of textiles as well, that I wasn't really didn't know much about when I was actually just working for a designer. Again, this is all embroidered. There's one of the samples, it's just there. So this is like kind of showing you, this is all computer machine embroidered. That sort of shows a close-up of the technique. So all of these designs would be sketched by me by hand first and then into the computer. And then instead of screen printing it, I ended up doing it all as embroidery. Again, sort of showing different collections. So each collection kind of is inspired by different designs or whatever my sort of mood was for that specific collection. I absolutely love black and white, and this collection was really great. It was a lot of sort of color as well, but solid sort of black and white motif, which looked great. This sort of design really stands out, but we use the same, again, in sort of colorway options as well. Again, it's sort of working with print as well. I also work with like embroidery as well, sort of woven fabrics. So even this design was sort of done by hand by myself, but then I work with the weavers to actually get this fabric woven into a textile fabric. So it's almost, that's again, sort of the textiles that really sort of opens up the chance to play with silk screening, with knitwear, with woven. You kind of get to play with all these different mediums, which kind of keeps it all alive and exciting. So even this design, that's all computer embroidered. So this is just a new project that I'm sort of still developing, working with the suppliers. And you'll see some of the pieces there. And this is just sort of like really sort of trying out different techniques. And this is all like screen printed. This ends up being digital printed. And just trying to see what techniques and how each design will look on different kind of fabrics to get that sort of texture. This fabric already has texture and the print had texture. So we're using a fabric that kind of gives it a little bit more of a different feel. So it's really sort of selecting fabrics that you can kind of really change the feel of the design. That's embroidered. This is screen printed. Again, you'll see some of those fabrics down there. Again, this is screen printed, but what I liked about it, because the texture of the fabric, it made it look like it was woven, even though it's screen printed. And that's all embroidered as well. That was always the joy for me, was textiles. Instead of painting on a canvas, I felt like I was always working, like fabric was my canvas. And it gave me the opportunity to sort of create these designs inspired by travel, life, inspiration from everyday things. So that sort of kind of brings me down to sort of my work. But then I sort of do like these freelance projects where I'll go and work with brands. This is a project I just finished with Zimmerman in Sydney. And it was really sort of inspired. They gave me a couple of their prints and they wanted me to create something for them. So this was, again, the mood board and the inspiration I gave them of sort of just for color. And then taking some of their classic designs and then doing it in, so this was theirs, and then I'm giving them different options of design. So this is like kind of everything's designed on a Photoshop sort of PDF file. Again, this could end up being printed, it could be embroidered. It just sort of shows you different ways of working. So I kind of work within fashion and then work back into home. Again, one of their designs, doing it in a different colorway. Again, this was one of their designs, but we've done it in these different options. And whether they silk screen this or they digital printed, majority of their fabrics end up being digitally printed. So this was their design. They wanted me to come up with something new for them. So it kind of really shows you how you can sort of play with textiles in so many different ways and sort of express yourself. And that sort of brings it sort of my kind of work to an end. So I've got like fabrics there if you guys want to sort of have a feel and look at them and, got any questions, please feel free.